Good morning, everyone. Michael, good morning to you. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Of course.
This is another in our series of Frontline Conversations with leaders around the region. And Michael, Michael Amilcar, the CEO of Cook Ross, class of 2019. We got a lot of 2019 members on the call today, Michael. So they're supporting you big time, raising the bar. 2019 is a great class. I got to say that. So I always say that. Anyway, let's start off with, I always start these off with asking the sort of personal question of how you're doing. And when we started these, it was about COVID and how's your health. Now it's more about how's your health and your mental health. So Michael, how are you doing?
You know, I want to tell you clearly, honestly, and powerfully that I am not okay. I mean, how could I be? I am, as a Black person, shown every day in this country that my life has little to no value. That because of the color of my skin, that I am rendered a second-class citizen in this country. To be under the barrage of media and messages, I mean, to know that a Black man was found hanging from a tree in 2020 is beyond incomprehensible given America's history with lynching. And to know that this is something I have lived my entire life, and there are just too many examples to name. But maybe I do want to share just one moment, some awareness that I have right now, 11:05 a.m. on June 15th, because as you said, I'm a CEO, I'm a business owner. Many of you are very familiar with Cook Ross. But for me personally, while I do have a lot of privilege, I also acknowledge obviously where I do not. And as I sit in Potomac, Maryland, right here in the DMV, speaking to some of the most accomplished leaders in this area, it's just to know that I feel loss of power constantly. I feel oppression constantly. And who I want to raise up right now is my family. I'm from Chicago. My mother, my father, and my three brothers. Right there, that reveals a lot about me. First, I'm a woman named Michael, and I'm the only girl in a family of boys. They are blue-collar workers. They are what we are now calling essential, something that is just unfathomable given to name it that. I have a brother who's right now driving a CTA bus, the Chicago Avenue line, for those who are familiar, who deals with tremendous risk of safety and life, going from the Deep West Side to the Miracle Magnificent Mile, where the riches and the economics are so barren. My other brother, who's a TSA agent, who, when I asked him how they were taking care of him, he says they gave us more hand sanitizer. Like, what? You know, that was his extra protection. You know, and my other brother who has his trucker's license, and so proud that he is driving PPE equipment back and forth. But think about the exposure that he's getting and the risk that he's taking in doing such. And so I just want to say I'm not okay. And I just want to give anyone on this call permission. I think there is so much power in speaking the truth that you are not okay, if that is true for you.
So you talked about your brothers, and it really was a concern about COVID.
Yeah.
But now we've got this extra concern of the police brutality that we're seeing. And just this weekend, we had another situation in Atlanta where two officers were talking to someone very peacefully for about 20 plus minutes. Mm-hmm. And then they got into an altercation and they shot him in the back and killed him. Or one of them shot him in the back and killed him, which I don't, you know, as a former county executive, that's not the way you do policing. I just don't understand how that could have happened. However, you're dealing with that now as well. So talk to us a little more about that. You talked about the oppression. Where are you at right now?
So as it relates to law enforcement and in my life, it's so inextricably tied. I have known my whole life this awareness of how police treat those who look like us, and in certain communities. And I'm speaking to you for those who do know my own personal story. The brother that I told you is so proud to have his trucking license and to be trucking, spent 24 years in prison. 24 years in prison at a time. This is a person who had no previous record, nothing that would warrant, that sort of treatment, but it was a pickup game of basketball at the local high school that turned bad. Someone, not him, pulled out a gun. The bullet accidentally hit someone else, but they took all of those boys who were playing and they all went to prison. Mm. We didn't know enough. We didn't have enough knowledge to know that, to sever the cases, or, we believed that, we'll just follow the line and then it'll just all be, of course he's going to be exonerated. And my mother, who worked for 40 years at the post office, had a friend at the post office tell her about a lawyer who had no criminal, lawyer background, but certainly just believing that with good heart and that the truth would come out. And it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. And so for him to have gone through that experience and then now to be called an essential work, you cannot imagine the beaming pride that this man has when he was told he was nothing. When he was told to just toe the line, And so to see that and to have that experience be so personal to my experience. We're respectfully called Irish twins because we're 11 months apart. Probably need to reframe that now. But nonetheless, it is.
I know all about Irish twins.
We all have to do our own work. So language. So how might I reframe that? So we are 11 months apart. So this is facts. And so most of the people thought we were twins. And so to have us have the same sort of upbringing, but go in completely divergent life paths, goes to show you how personal this is and is why I do this work.
So 5 years ago, LGW did a session on police community relations with a police chief, with a former state's attorney, and with Howard John Wesley from Alfred Street Baptist Church, who just had a big rally prayer session actually at Black Lives Matter Plaza over the weekend. And here we are, this is after Ferguson and Michael Brown, and here we are 5 years later, and it seems to be getting worse. It seems to, the number of people being killed seems to be worse.
Yes.
The stupidity of police officers just sort of losing their self-control seems to be getting worse. So how do you feel, as a Black person, how do you feel about that? And how do you suggest we start to make some change here that will last? I mean, 5 years ago, I would not have said this is where we would be today with righteous unrest throughout the country. I was very hopeful then, and I am not as hopeful anymore.
Sure. Well, one is just to acknowledge the pain and to say that I do still have hope, and I still do find ways for self-care, and happy to talk more about that. But really, I must protect myself. I must protect my mental well-being, as you started this call with. And so I have so appreciated just having the space to understand that that there are times when I'm happy to speak about certain topics, and there's times when I'm just not, in order to conserve my own mental well-being around it. But I will lift up the words of D. Ray McKesson, who maybe as most of you as a supporter of the Black Lives Matter movement, which are words that I share with my team years ago, but still are relevant today, that says, when I think of freedom, to me, it represents not only the absence of oppression, but the presence of justice and joy, which means we need to be as thoughtful about taking down the bad things as we are about building up the beautiful future that we want. A world of equity and joy is not a world that we have yet lived in. And so that requires us to imagine. And what we talk about at Cook Ross is reimagining a new future. And I think that that's what's being missed in the defund the police, that people are getting stuck on the word defund, but really it's a call to reimagine, to not say, let's just tinker with what is, but how might we reimagine the way that safety should be done, and to do it in such a way where their funds are aligning with what we say we want, not what we don't want.
So how do we go about making that structural change? I mean, that's something that you work with every day at Cook Ross, and it's extraordinarily difficult. It's dealing with a police department. They are, again, speaking as a former elected official, they are set in their ways,
Yes.
consider themselves separate from the rest of the government. They're very sensitive to any kind of criticism. How do you go about making structural change here that will really last and make a difference?
Yeah, that's why I was really glad to have this conversation. And I was telling you, it's probably a good time in the series to be talking about this, because for me, for us, it's about systems changes. Where do you end systemic racism, and where do you end it inside of systems? And tends to be a lot of focus on the interpersonal or the individual changing hearts and minds. And I'm not saying that that's not important or that's not a part of it, but quite honestly, I would say 90% of the energy goes there and less of it is going to, well, how do we address this from a systems perspective? And so just to say that certainly there needs to be a changed heart and mind, what we call a shifting consciousness, a source, and that's just an awareness. It's not some, metaphysical shift. It's just an awareness. And so what's happening in corporate America is that it starts with this messages that you're seeing propagated throughout social media, which are statements coming from organizations themselves stating their commitment. And so while people are saying, great, okay, well, show me your executive team, and then what's next? I just want to acknowledge that you do need a leader inside the organization, first and foremost, who at least has an awareness that's opened up to even allow for the conversation for systems change to happen. And so I thought I might just take some time to share with you exactly what we see inside of organizations, and to really not hear this as a checklist for you, because it's not a checklist. There is no simple list, and what works for other organizations may not work for you. So it's so important to know that you need to ask yourself what specifically it is that you want to change. And so one that's mentioned, and I know that I can overwhelm with like the amount of things. So I'm just going to stick to a few, knowing that behind that there's so much more. But I think what was offered even by one of your other guests was around, having an equity audit done. And this is really important because in any type of change effort, you want to say, where are we now? And where do we want to go? And that's how you sort of close the gap. And so to do an equity audit, to understand where do the inequities live. But even without an audit, before you go through a formal audit process, just think for yourself. And I just want to invite you, think about your own organizations. And where, if you were asked today, where do you think the greatest opportunity is to right size the racial inequities are within your organization? Because unless your organization looks like ours, and I do invite you to look on our About Us page, this is so shocking. It is so shocking when people go to our website and they see our About Us page and they see this beautiful reflection of all these faces. They say, wow, you're so diverse. But look how revealing that is, that a diversity company is actually diverse, because the truth is that not all diversity organizations are diverse, which that is a whole nother, but I won't, maybe that's for another time. But just to say so look inside and say, and I would say that largely if your organization doesn't reflect a lot of diversity, that means something, that is saying something, that whether you acknowledge it or not, is basically saying that there is no value to having the presence of those who look like the reflection of America inside your walls. And I don't care whether you're a 3-person company or 30,000, that just to acknowledge, what does that say? And so starting there. The other thing is just to look at strategy. So what is your organizational strategy?
Michael, let me ask a question. So if I wanted to do an equity audit, how would I do that? Who would I go to?
Well, there's many organizations that certainly do that. You certainly can, and I would encourage you to get a partner if you don't feel strong enough in this area, but not everyone needs an outside partner. You can certainly get consultation, but you can also, companies are used to doing audits of any kind, and just ask, like I said, start with what is it that you want. So if you look at your attrition data, or you look at your recruiting data, or you look at your executive board, and you just cut the numbers by race, gender, any dimension that you feel like matters to your organization as it relates to diversity. But also, even I use the nomenclature diversity, but to also be specific, like what diversity, we always say this to clients, we want more diversity. name specifically what you want. We say the umbrella diversity to accommodate a lot, but is it more Black persons? Is it more women? Is it more millennial women? You know, and that just to know that if you say that your diversity is for women and you don't name specifically Black women, most times that's heard as for white women. And so I would just say you can do it just through, if you're already doing assessments, and most organizations do cultural assessments, but just take the time to look at the next level of race in them.
Now you started talking about strategy as the next
strategy. You know, thinking that, you know, a lot of people think of diversity and equity as over there, handled by the head of diversity or the chief diversity officer. And those organizations who see it as separate from their organizational strategy are really missing something. That it shouldn't be separate. It's not something over there. It needs to be integrated and embedded throughout everything that you do. And so when you're thinking about leadership development, or you're thinking about even supplier diversity, let's talk about that. Everyone spends money on suppliers. You know, where are you bringing a racial equity lens to that? How much money do you spend with those businesses who are minority or woman owned, you know, certified as that, or certainly just aren't? And so we just did a Black Lives Matter installation, and I do invite you to drive by Georgia Avenue in Silver Spring, because we took the power of our, having the whole side of Georgia Avenue, we have Black Lives Matter. But even the 3 Black employees who wanted to do that, you know, we thought, well, we always use FedEx, which is downstairs, but where can we do some economic justice too? So we went and we found a Black-owned fast signs, you know, franchisee in DC, and had them make the installation. And just the delight of, well, not only will we do it, we'll install it for you. But, you know, just, I don't care whether it's the plumber, I don't care if it's your payroll company, but have you done an audit of just examining, you know, where are you even spending your dollars, and just making a commitment to increase that by 15%, 20%, even charitable giving. So I would say that I know that people ask, what can we do? But to me, you can think on your own without Michael Leslie Amilcar telling you any of this, of things that you can do to advance, you know, to advance racial equity inside your organization.
So what we've talked about really are sort of personal things that you can do. And you mentioned the individual, the structural change. And I think for the police, for law enforcement, for criminal justice, we need some structural change. We have seen a little bit at the federal level in terms of the sentencing guidelines and things like that, but how do you go about structural change? How do you I know it's a combination of individuals, but how do you make it bigger?
It is so important, though, that we recognize that systems are created by people. And so they are separate, but to not discount and make it seem like it's just some system, laws, processes, guidelines are created by people. So looking at who has power and privilege and authority inside of an organization. So the way we look at systems is through that. Policies, processes, and guidelines, because what you reward and recognize is the behaviors that you will get. Largely what you compensate people for is exactly what you'll get. So if you do not tie certain goals to compensation, then of course you will get the behavior that is expected. So we look at, and so as part of the audits, we do that. We look at what are your systems, and what are the systems that support the status quo, and what can we do to change? And we focus on people leaders, because we believe while we can certainly do education for every of your team member, which is where most organizations want to go, who has the most influence in an organization are those who are people leaders, you know, as distinct from just managers, those who guide and direct people. And that sometimes clients call us and they're saying, oh, we need this, or we need this because our leaders are doing this. And I don't mean to laugh, but I think this is not a diversity or inclusion issue. This is just bad leadership skills in general, you know? And so just to start there, that we do offer a lot of work around inclusive leadership and talk about what the skills that are needed for that. But just leadership is sorely lacking. Sorry, I was gonna make another comment, but just look for yourself in terms of the lack of leadership, or even leadership that you feel like you can trust. And so that's where we look at it. And then we look at the policies and guidelines that we were working with an organization that didn't recognize, they couldn't understand why at a certain level that Black professionals would sort of opt out, you know, so sort of like a level 5 out of 9. And what they recognized was that there was something that actually it was at level 5 that you were considered sort of senior. And so they dropped what was a mentor sponsor kind of relationship. And so once they ended that, because you've gotten to level 5, then you realize that people didn't have the support that they actually needed. So things like that. I mean, I could go on and on, as you know.
I really appreciate your comment about leadership, because that's been sort of a comment of mine over the last several years, particularly in the political world, but I think we're seeing it in the business world. There's no vision out there. There's no leaders who have vision for the long term. It's all about the short term. It's how do I get through the next election? Who cares if it hurts the jurisdiction or the country 10 years down the road? It's going to help me get reelected. And it's been very frustrating for me, because it is difficult to say, we got to look long term, we got to look big picture, we got to do things for the greater good. And that does take courage. It takes some leadership that we're not seeing today in our country, I'm sorry to say.
Yeah, and I know that there's a lot of resources that are talking about this current moment, but what you said prompted me to think that I felt like it was a gift that right before COVID happened, so back in January, I had just finished reading Simon Sinek's The Infinite Game, because I was confused about leadership and why certain things were happening or not happening. And so this is probably not a resource that you would have heard given talking about anti-racism, because it's not that, but it talks about leadership and how there are those playing finite games and there are those playing infinite games. And that when you're up to an infinite game, which is what we're up to at Cook Ross, you're thinking well beyond your own satisfaction and your own limited needs. You're thinking about world change events. So I just throw that out there as well.
No, that's absolutely needed. I mean, it's so necessary to do that. Yeah. And again, we're just not, sorry to say, we're not seeing it from our political leaders at the national, state, and local levels. I mean, it's sort of across the board. It's a real shame. So in terms of this structural change, and that's what you do, you're a change agent. What are some of the difficulties you see in making that happen? And also, what are some of the good news stories you have, the companies that are doing the right thing, that are making these changes and have been doing for some of them, not just in response to what we've seen over the last couple of weeks?
It's so true. You know, I think one of the failures so one of the failures that I think, of course, we know that happens in this country is that we don't really hear about what's working. We hear a lot about what's not working. And that has just a lot to do with ratings and the like, and how money is made in that way. But doing this work for as long as I've been doing it and as we've been doing it, you actually are surrounded in hope and power, and so when my friends call me who aren't in the space railing away, and I go, well, actually, we have the blessing and the privilege to actually see organizations doing it right. Now, we do see organizations not doing it right too, to be clear. And what we say is, is that we don't focus on that. But we certainly acknowledge that for many, many years, there are people, once again, organizations are not amorphous. There are people inside of organizations who are committed to real change. And to your point, it's not easy. There was a large athletic retailer who had approached us because they were having an issue with their store associates who were not approaching Black customers, and were instead sort of going towards the typical soccer mom because that's where they felt more comfortable, and then assumed that there was going to be more relational there. But think about that. That actually they had to do training to show that it was actually that 16-year-old kid who actually will spend 3 times as much on an athletic wear or gym shoe at that time. And so that's just sort of just like being aware of our own unwillingness to sort of approach someone who's different, and yet how it was having real economic impact on the store. And it wasn't like, and I know it may be heard like, oh, they were just doing that to sort of make money. It was like, no, people who actually are in business feel like I have something that is perfect for a particular market, right? And so it was about, what a loss that I have this gym shoe or t-shirt or donut, whatever it is, and I can't get it to the market audience that I really do feel like is a match for what their desire is too. And so we talked about the consultation process for that. And one that I won't soon forget is, this is years ago, but still the case where a major home improvement retailer was caught between 2 factions, both from their customer base and their employee base, dealing with independent contractors standing out in the parking lot in order to provide their services to others. And then you had some that was like, good job, you home retailer, you home improvement retailer, for allowing them that opportunity. And there were others who were just vile. They should be gone. They should be rounded up. And so it is not easy. It's not easy when it's within your employee base, when it's within your organization or the society, where it's like, damned if you do, damned if you don't. And so we're not saying that it's always easy, but we can have conversations about bringing multiple stakeholders inside the space to talk about what we can do to move forward together respectfully.
So how about, we got a question from someone on, from Mahan Tavakoli, our chair, on how do you approach people who say they get it, but they don't really get it? And I think we saw two examples of that over the weekend with Greg Popovich, the coach of the San Antonio Spurs, saying, you know, I'm dealing with these issues with my players, and I thought I knew, but I didn't understand it all. Then David Axelrod had a piece in the paper about the same sort of thing. So how do you coach someone or get someone to open their eyes and say, I'm talking a good game, but I'm not doing it for real?
So I'm going to answer that in two ways. So one, part of our systems change curriculum, it's not really, it's a framework that really does take many years in order to actually see systems change. So if you thought there was a magic pill and that you could do a town hall and one training, it doesn't work that way. Anybody who knows change management, it takes years to make change. But one important component in our offering is to be aware that resistors are real, and they do live inside your organization. So if it's all just about, if I just give them more data and facts, they are going to come along and be along for the ride, is not the case at all. And so I'm not interested in changing minds. I actually had this conversation with my sister-in-law, and she was shocked. She was like, but how do you change a racist to being a non-racist and inside of an organization? And I said, I don't actually care about that. She's like, what do you mean? You're the D&I expert. I was like, no, because really, I think we focus too much on the internal. I can't control an internal. I can control behavior. I can manage and reward and acknowledge behaviors. So be a raving racist if you want to. You are to advance people of all identities and colors within the organization. You are to support these efforts. You are to speak this line. That's it. You know, and I think that we get caught up, and I just really want them to believe in it, you know, and we've chosen to focus on where we can see measurable behavior and outcomes, because I promise you, and I'm not the first person to say this, but that people are not in the streets because they want to be loved more. It's because violence is happening to Black bodies and lives. And I'm not talking about just the violence from law enforcement. I'm talking about the violence every day, even inside of organizations, where we either have to cover who we truly are, or otherwise have to kowtow to others because of our identity. And it's just not fair. I mean, that's an understatement. But.
The whole systemic violence issue is one that I've been aware of and talked about for quite some time. It is during the sniper shootings a long time ago. There were 10 people killed by the snipers in so many jurisdictions in this region. Yes. In the same time, in the same period of time, 9 other people were killed in sort of everyday random violence or daily violence. And the whole world looked at the 10 who were killed by the snipers. No one looked at the 9 who were killed in this everyday violence. It was sort of, you know, noise behind us that we didn't need to pay attention to. We had a thought leadership series this year that got cut short because of the COVID situation, but it was all about ending systemic violence in our neighborhoods through economic opportunity. And I think we get back.
In many ways. Even when we focus on death, it's not always those who just got killed, but what about those who got maimed or otherwise harmed? And just the violence of actually the images and the showing, not having, you know, I have a 9-year-old and a 4-year-old. You know, I thought I knew it. I was like, I'm prepared for this school thing because, you know, I'm an expert in this. Whatever they don't get in the classroom, they're going to get it at home. And boy, how naive I was. Do you know how naive I was that, and so that's my passion point when I'm not doing work inside of organizations. And by the way, we do work not only in corporate organizations and higher ed, law firms, healthcare systems, certainly, and nonprofits. But my personal passion is around the curriculum that our children get exposed to every day, because they're not learning about history. And I'm saying they're not learning about history. And to even say they should learn about Black history, I'm just letting you know, I don't say they should learn about Black history. That is American history. That is American history. And I've always loved Dr. Janetta Cole, who, when she talks about the African American Museum, she doesn't say that it's the Museum of African American History. It's the Museum of American History as seen through the eyes of African Americans. And it's the same for all dimensions, is that just to think that there's one way to tell a story, it's like, no, there isn't. And so that's my personal passion.
So if you're working with a company and they are very hesitant because they don't want to make a misstep, they don't want to make a mistake, they don't want to get it wrong, so they don't do anything, how do you convince them that it's worth it to move forward, even if you do misstep from time to time?
So yeah, it just goes into knowing that there's going to be mistakes, and so the truth is, we are not that large as an organization, although most people don't know it. We always have to remind these billion-dollar companies, that we're like, we are available, but we're under 50 persons. And so, I mean, certainly we have other contractors that maybe make it higher than that, but they overassume what we can do. So the truth is, we don't work with clients who we have to convince. If you want to be convinced, just go over there. Like, we work with clients who are already knowing that it's going to be messy, and that it's going to be mistakes made, and that our job is not to prevent mistakes. And actually, it's not to prevent conflict. Wherever humans gather is conflict. That's one of the basic tenets of mediation. It's not to prevent conflict. It's to how do we heal, rectify, and come back together after conflict has happened. And I think that sort of ties to any of the messages around, slavery in America, is that the reason that we're having a lot of these issues is because there hasn't been a reconciliation. There hasn't even been an acknowledgement of the wrong that's been made. So I think we take that into organizations saying the same thing, is that this is not going to be pretty. And also, you're not going to pay us to do your work for you. We are your guide. We are your partner. We can give you best practices along the way, but you have to do your work. We'll do our work. And I tell you, there's companies that call and say, well, just do it for us. Just come inside, lead the town hall. It's like, it doesn't actually work that way. And so I feel privileged to be able to say there is a particular client that we're looking to partner with, because we're also committed to systems change. It's too much energy to try to convince someone.
So that leads right into a question from Donald Dunn. How do you know when someone's ready to change? How do you know when they're ready for your services versus there's going to be a lot of resistance?
They're ready when they are putting, one is that that your CEO, your leadership is driving this, not that there's somebody in HR or on the diversity team that's driving this. And so often we ask for the CEO to be a part of those conversations. And secondly, economics. I tell you, it's astounding to me when we have these conversations and they say, I want you to do these things. I want you to cause this great change. And we have $6,000. And you're just like, I can't even imagine any change ever that was come. And we're not ashamed to say that it's going to, it's an investment. We don't look at it as a cost. It's an investment. I've glibly said to companies, you spend more on your coffee for your employees than you're going to spend on this budget. And that just speaks to where your priorities are. And so it depends on the size of the organization, but if you're not really willing to invest from your leadership, as you say, willing to do an examination on an assessment of kind of where you are and where you want to go, and or willing to commit funds to it, then you're not serious. Then you really aren't. You're just talking. And so that's still good for those of you who are championing. I'm not saying give up, but just know that that's what it's going to take. And to use what you know about the organization to where something else matters, and then do the comparison and say, well, you say this matters and we spend this amount on this. Why aren't we doing the same in terms of investment? Thanks, Don, for the question.
What trends are you seeing in terms of firms engaging Cook Ross or engaging firms like you? And what are people looking for? Where are they headed? What are they asking for? Has anything changed recently, or?
Well, I don't know. I forgot to turn off my Outlook before the start, so you might be hearing the dings of all the emails, the requests that we're getting, and they come from all places. certainly just the overwhelm of requests, which, I take that as a good sign, certainly being in the conversation. But, the disheartening is those organizations, like you said, who don't even know the first step. It's like, help us write this post or this letter, or they're otherwise asking their HR person. Do you know how exhausting it is to have your HR person, especially if they're a Black person? And if you look at the stats for HR, that's where senior leadership, when there is someone on the leadership team, they happen to be a chief diversity officer or an HR. If they're Black, that's a whole nother conversation. But you're asking this Black person to both deal with their own pain and grieving and then write your statement for you, going back to leadership. I'm not saying that this shouldn't be a collective effort to make sure that it is meeting the needs of and sort of getting inclusion. But I'm talking about don't even know where to start. What do I say to my Black employees? So I do have hope. I'm not going to change that. I still have joy. But it's astounding to me that in a world where we know that emotional intelligence and compassion is a pillar of leadership, that people feel such at a loss. And I just feel that people need to really just do their own learnings. And there's been lots of resources shared, and I might just share a few at the end of this call.
So if I could, I'd like to just relate a personal story of mine and get your comments on what I could have done better or differently. So
I'm ready for it. You didn't even prep me for this. Go. I've been waiting for this conversation. Go.
We had a situation with our police department back when I was in Montgomery County, where the chief and I went to the home of a man who had been hospitalized after an arrest by the police. So there's an altercation. He'd been arrested. He had to go to the hospital. And we went to tell them that we went to the guy's house. They kicked us out, but we did say we're going to make sure there's a fair and impartial investigation, that we're taking this very seriously, and that you deserve that. And then I met with the senior leadership, the command leadership of the police department. I had two of our top officers tell me that that was the worst thing that has ever happened in the history of the Montgomery County Police Department. Going to that person's house and telling them that we're going to do an impartial investigation was absolutely horrible for the police officers in Montgomery. And this is a department that I'll just name one incident where a training officer, so an officer who was training another soon-to-be officer, stopped his patrol car in an apartment complex, told the training officer, the trainee, to sit and wait. He went in and shot someone to death who was fooling around with his girlfriend. And yet that is not the level of bad as telling someone we're going to do a fair investigation. I really shook my head at that and was very concerned about that. It really said something to me about the mentality of these two officers in particular, but just looking out. I didn't, make a big stink about it. I did talk with the chief and some others about it, but that's sort of what we're dealing with here.
Sure. Yeah, we've talked with law. So one, thank you for sharing that story, because I don't think we know enough of the stories about a time when, that takes courage to keep talking about where this happened. I'm not quite sure if I did the right thing, but I'm in exploration of what I could have done differently. And I think that the thing to do is just disrupt it when it happens. But it is also about educating yourself about kind of what is. And I feel a little silly saying that, given your the political heights that you've reached. But we've done work with law enforcement, and what has really shifted with law enforcement is the way that, surprise, surprise, the way that they are rewarded and acknowledged, and that we have shifted from policing that used to be community oriented, and it used to be more about de-escalating and letting people kind of go on their ways, to being very monetized. Everything from parking tickets. I don't need to tell anybody on this call, just say, when you're rewarded for writing tickets and for arrests and for otherwise things that they know fund their salaries, their pension, and what behaviors would you expect except for that? And there's also just been there is a difference I see in in the way that there are, because we've worked with leaders who have been police officers from generations ago. I sound like I'm like young. I'm not young. I'm definitely, but from older generations that talk about the mentorship that they used to get, and that really people learn from their leaders. What are we hearing about with the George Floyd case? Well, that was my leader. How did you expect me to step up? Let me transfer that to another industry, because when you're doing change management, you look for success elsewhere that might apply here. So one of the biggest issues in healthcare, there's so many issues in healthcare, but one of the biggest issues around that was costing healthcare a lot of money was called wrong site surgery. So you wouldn't, that has definitely dissipated, but why is that? It was two things. It was power and privilege inside of a healthcare system. You had nurses who didn't feel empowered to tell the doctor you're operating on the wrong arm. Now think about that. Think about when you have a culture where the power dynamic is so great that a person doesn't even feel like that they can speak up. And then, now they've created accountability. So now that's why you get all the purple marks all over you, and they look at the and they say, is this exactly what it's supposed to be, so that they don't do that. So they've developed a process to prevent that. And I think if you apply that the same, it's not an easy lift and go over, but we need to examine the power and privilege that happens and how people get rewarded, not just financially, but certainly from a feeling of belonging as part of a community, right? This is the same thing if you think about gang initiation. I'm just saying, look at the parallels, right? That there is some value that I feel when I'm acknowledged by my peers in a way that makes me feel inflated or have that pride of belonging. And that's what needs to be disrupted. So we don't do training. People are like, do training for police officers. Did you know that in Minneapolis, they went through all the training? They went through hours of bias training. They had gone through that. So they had done the 2 years of work, and this still happened. So for those of you who are thinking, who didn't know that, see, we know that because we're in the field. So we have to kind of have a lot of that background, but it's not more training of officers. There is something inherent with the system.
We've got a question from Michelle Booth Cole. It says, what suggestions would you share for how nonprofit organizations should proceed in this work, since most white people working in the nonprofit sector think they're already there in terms of being anti-racist?
Oh, it's so
80%
true.
of nonprofits are led by white staff, not to mention nonprofit boards, which are not as diverse as they should be.
Well, I don't want to make an assumption that obviously because of skin color, because there are certainly a lot of white persons who are actively involved in anti-racism work and who've been actively involved in equity work. And so we don't make those assumptions either, but we do get a lot of calls and we do a lot of work with nonprofits who say that through their own race equity, they understand that they are their organization has a certain demographic makeup that doesn't often match with the service area. And so that's just a look as an exploration, but it's just really, it's no different. Nonprofit is still a system. It's saying, where from your leadership, where can you find examples from your peers who are doing it well? I was already mentioned before, RAG and all that they did, and they even made the putting racism on the table, they made that complimentary, which by the way, we all looked at as well at Cook Cross. We're always looking for what people are doing to move the needle. So there are many, I would say similarly, I mean, you don't always have to get a consultant. You can always just ask your peers, organizations, what have they done in order to just get a good grounding on some stuff that you might take.
So I started off this conversation asking how you were doing, and now I'm asking you to share some good news with us. Any good news that you have out there? What you've seen in the last couple of weeks, couple of months, of people responding to this? Any LGW members that have reached out to you and sort of helped you a bit through this from your great class of 2019?
I have to give a shout out to my LGW class of 2019. I think the thing that I've been most appreciative of my class, but certainly for the larger leadership Greater Washington, is allowing for me to give my voice and to listen, because we have a group for at least our class, and then certainly I'm a part of other micro groups where I'm able to sort of share and otherwise vent and otherwise just talk about the need for us all to do our part from wherever we are, and to not think that just because you're not steeped in equity and anti-racism work that you can't do something. So I just want to acknowledge all of you who I know are on the call, and certainly those who I'm connected with, who have just given me personally the space to focus on my own grieving process. And so that's a gift that we don't talk about. And then of course, I do have to do some naming of some folks, just to say that I also want to say there's some people on this call who I appreciate your patience and understanding that there is a need to connect, and that we're going to do some great work together. So whether it's Carolyn Ellison or Mark Rigel at a wider circle, I want to do a shout out for Tamara Copeland, who met with me before COVID. And although we haven't connected face to face during this, that your writing and your posting and your voice is a gift. And I think that we don't see that. All of us are connected oftentimes on social media or LinkedIn. And so that you're providing respite, even when you don't realize how you're providing respite to other LGW. Certainly another class member, Carly Mitchell, who had me speak for the Junior League of Washington. This is in the middle of COVID, where we were already talking about how race dimensions. And so just to see her leadership, I know that her tenure as the president there has now come to an end, but just to be able to have the platform. And then of course, Natalie Randolph, who's doing wonderful things with Sidwell and what Sidwell is doing in terms of this work as well, to bring communities together. So my mind trust, Donald, yes, shout out to Donald Dunn, who asked one question. But the truth is that it's just been extraordinary to be a part of this group. And for all those who have been connected with Cook Ross, because we've done the D&I, the Diversity and Inclusion Day for so many years. It speaks a lot to the trust and the experience that you had to know that we are really committed to doing this compassionately and in a way that causes real change, and that we're not just here just trying to, make money. And there's organizations that are up to that, and we're just up to something different.
So Tamara Copeland has asked for the quote from DeRay McKesson, which we will get and we'll send out to everybody after this. Are there any, did we talk about some links or some information on how we can help, things we can look at? We'll get that out to people afterwards as well. So
yeah, I just want to, so thank you for that. I think in the how, I've heard you ask that, like, how can I help? The best way you can help is to not think that it's over there. So do your work where you are. And so for those on the call, do the work where you are. There's actually another part of that quote that I'll send about DeRay McKesson. He says, some people are like, what do I do? What do I do? Make sandwiches, bring water to the people who are protesting. There's always something you can do, And so just to ask for yourself, given your ability, because of some of our own ableism, we don't understand that there are some people who can't, who are immunocompromised, who don't feel comfortable protesting, but whatever that is inside your system. So what you can do is know that all of us play a part, and to do your part from where you are. And so also I want to just offer as resources. There's certainly system resources, and I was kind of resisting like sharing something because I don't want it to be seen as a checklist, but there's certainly a piece that we did for the Washington Business Journal that talks about advocacy, activism, and allyship, and how that can be a framework for how you do the work internally. But I would just also say, particularly to the Black persons on the call, just remember your own self-care. The most radical form of resistance is self-care, especially in a world that says that your life and your bodies don't matter. And so I know so many of us are like, now's the time. Those sound like familiar words that I've used. Now is the time, but also just to manage that, a lot of us have been dealing in this trauma all our lives. And so know when you need to take off your cape and allow for others to help solve. And then lastly, so the Robin DiAngelo White Fragility book, which everyone's talking about, I know is on back order for Amazon. But I would just invite that there's some wonderful, go to YouTube and watch her. I always like to hear the author speaking. There's a wonderful 1-hour videos, one that she did at the Seattle Library that really breaks it down, something that you can listen to in the car or just when you're washing the dishes or otherwise, maybe chasing after your kids, maybe that's my own story, that you can do that can actually listen to voices. And then for those of you, if you have the type of relationship with a Black friend and they feel that they are able to share with you kind of what they're feeling in the moment, that's great. But also you have no excuse. There's an inordinate amount of podcasts where you can actually listen to Black people talking about their experience and to really understand what that looks like. And so I just wanted, I can share a few, but there's Alicia Garza's Lady Don't Take No, who talks about systems change, which is why I lift hers up. She's one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. And then Nicole Hannah-Jones, the 1619 Project. I mean, you all don't need me. You have access to Google, but consider listening to voices and reading from others who perhaps have the Black identity and who have that strongly are committed to change.
Michael, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for your very honest comments, your advice for us, and your insight into what we're dealing with today. It's a very tough time for our country because it's not just the unrest, it's not just COVID, it's the economy, it's climate change. There's a lot of things happening all at once. They're really very difficult to deal with, and again, we don't have that leadership that we need to take us through it. So, thank you. I'll let you have the final word.
No, I always appreciate this conversation with anyone who is committed to real change, particularly for those leaders who are on the call. You are a part of LGW because you are committed to both leadership and service. And so just asking, what am I doing? What more can I do? And really partnering with others. I think the answer is going to be in the linking, in the interlinking of how we can move forward together and not just relying on one single body or one single organization to make the change.
Michael, thank you. It's been a great talk. I really appreciate your being with us today. Thank you very much.
I appreciate you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
That's my Zoom goodbye hands. Thank you all.